The corrugated steel walls of the Lethbridge Agricultural Fairgrounds rattled faintly in the October wind off the prairies, but inside nobody noticed. Inside, the air smelled of sawdust, diesel exhaust, and the particular electric tension that filled rooms where serious men spent serious money. The Western Canada Surplus Working Dog Auction was not open to the public. You needed an invitation, a registered bidding number, and a reason that satisfied the organizers, which meant you needed either a contract with a government body, a private security license, or enough zeros on your balance sheet to make the registration committee look the other way. The men packed into the folding chairs were executives from pipeline security firms, border transport contractors, and 2 representatives from a large private corrections company out of Calgary. They had arrived in trucks that cost more than most people's houses, and they drank the complimentary coffee without looking at it. Margot Théberge walked in through a side door with a crumpled bidding number pinned to the front of her canvas jacket and $4,300 in a certified check tucked into the interior breast pocket next to her heart. She was 24 years old. She had driven 9 hours from Moose Jaw in a 2009 pickup with a cracked windshield and a heater that worked on and off depending on the mood of the engine. She had not slept. She had stopped twice, once for gas outside Swift Current, and once to sit on the side of the Transcanada with her hands on the steering wheel and cry until she felt hollow enough to drive again. Then she wiped her face, pulled back onto the highway, and kept going. The dog she had come for was listed in the auction catalogue as Lot 19. Belgian Malinois, female, 6 years old, 4 years active service, RCMP National Division transfer. The catalogue noted, in the clipped language of bureaucratic disposal, that the animal had been classified as unsuitable for redeployment due to severe handler bonding complications and elevated threat response. It recommended Lot 19 for stationary perimeter security only, under the supervision of an experienced handler at a controlled facility. What the catalogue did not say, what no catalogue ever said, was that the dog's name was Ridgeline, and that she had been the working partner of RCMP Corporal Denis Théberge for 3 years, and that Denis Théberge had died 14 months ago in a drainage culvert outside of Portage-la-Prairie, while Ridgeline stood over him and refused to let anyone near his body until backup arrived. Denis was Margot's father. The auction floor was already moving by the time Margot found a spot along the wall near the back. A stocky auctioneer in a fleece vest worked through the lots with practiced ease, his voice a flat Saskatchewan monotone that somehow carried clean to every corner of the building. Lot 12 went for $11,000 to a man who didn't blink. Lot 15, a retired German shepherd with a partial hearing loss, went for $8,500 after a brief 3-way bidding war that resolved in under 90 seconds. The men in this room were not here to deliberate. Margot looked at the check in her hand. $4,300. It was her emergency fund, her car repair money, and 3 months of rent combined. She had moved it into a certified check the morning after her mother's friend had called with the information. The information that Ridgeline was being liquidated, that she was on a list, that unless someone with a bidding number and a registered reason showed up in Lethbridge on the 22nd of October, the dog was going to a private security contractor who ran patrol operations on an oil sands facility north of Fort McMurray. That she was going to spend whatever years she had left pacing a chain-link enclosure in the dark, 300 kilometers from the nearest town, in a place where the temperature dropped to -40 and the wind never stopped. Margot had called the RCMP detachment in Ottawa. She had been transferred 4 times and then told politely that Ridgeline was a Crown asset and subject to standard disposition procedures. She had written to her MP. She had written to the Commissioner of. She had received 6 weeks later a form letter expressing appreciation for her correspondence and confirming that all animal disposition processes followed federal guidelines. She had kept both letters in a folder in her glove compartment, and then driven 9 hours to Lethbridge anyway, because there was nothing else left to do. She had found out about the auction through a man named Phil Okafor, a retired RCMP dog handler who had worked with her father years earlier, who had made 4 phone calls on her behalf, and then called her back and said, quietly and without comfort, that the only way to stop this was to be in that room with a bidding number. She did not have nearly enough money. She knew that. Phil knew that. They had not spoken about it directly. The auctioneer was moving through his sheet. Lot 17, Lot 18, Lot 19. The side door of the staging area opened, and 2 handlers came through it walking backwards. Leaning into their weight, they were holding long aluminum control poles, and at the end of the poles was Ridgeline. Margot's hand went to her mouth before she could stop it. The dog looked nothing like the photograph her father had kept on the corkboard above his desk, the one where Ridgeline was mid-leap in a training field, ears flat, every muscle extended, bright-eyed and burning. The dog the handlers dragged onto the auction floor was thinner, her tan coat dull and matted along her haunches. A thick nylon muzzle covered her face, and her eyes moved constantly, tracking every corner of the room with the anxious vigilance of an animal that had not felt safe in a very long time. She pulled hard against the control poles in short, rhythmic surges, not the explosive aggression of a dangerous dog, but the persistent resistance of a dog that had simply stopped trusting what hands intended. She looked exhausted. She looked like an animal that had been waiting for something for 14 months and had not found it. Lot 19, the auctioneer said into his microphone. Belgian Malinois, female, 6 years old, 4 years with RCMP National Division. Full disclosure on this one. The file indicates significant behavioral volatility post-Hainler loss. She has been assessed by 2 independent veterinary behaviorists. The recommendation is experienced handler only, controlled environment, stationary security application. He paused and looked at his clipboard with the expression of a man completing paperwork. Bidding opens at $1,000. Margot raised her numbered card before the auctioneer's eyes had finished scanning the room. 1,000, from the young lady in the back. A man near the front, beefy in a quilted vest with a company logo on the chest, turned and looked at her. He had the specific look of someone who has just noticed a small inconvenience. He turned back and raised his own card without expression. 1,500. 2,000, Margot said. Heads turned. She kept her face still. The man in the quilted vest, she would learn his name later, would see it on the contract transfer paperwork. Before she drove home, Darren Bryce, Director of Asset Management at Sentinel Prairie Security Solutions, looked at her with a faint corporate patience that was somehow more dismissive than contempt. He raised his card again. 3,000. Margot's stomach turned over. She had 4,300. She could go to 4. She had no idea what she would do after that. She had not let herself think that far, because thinking that far meant accepting that there was a threshold she could not cross, and she was not ready to accept that yet. She raised her card. 3,500. There was a murmur somewhere in the middle of the room. People were looking at her now, not with sympathy, not with hostility, but with the detached interest of spectators watching something that was happening to someone else. Darren Bryce raised his card with the same expression someone used when they pressed the elevator button a second time. 4,000. Margot stood very still. She had $4,300. She had exactly $300 of room left, and the man bidding against her had not broken a sweat. She raised her card. 4,300. That was everything. That was the floor of the building, and she was standing on it. Bryce paused, but only for a moment. Just long enough for the pause to mean something. Long enough to communicate that he had noticed, and that it did not matter. 6,000, he said. The auctioneer's eyes went back to Margot. She lowered her card. She did not make a sound. She stood against the wall with her arms at her sides, and she looked at Ridgeline, who had stopped pulling against the control poles. The dog was standing on the auction floor with her head low, her sides moving with each breath, her eyes scanning the room in long, slow arcs. Every few seconds the arc paused, not on the auctioneer, not on the handlers, not on the bidders in their chairs. Margot could not tell where the dog was looking. She could not tell if it mattered. She thought about the photograph on her father's corkboard. She thought about the way her father had talked about Ridgeline. Not the way people talked about animals they owned, but the way they talked about someone they had gone through something with. He had never called Ridgeline his dog. He had called her his partner. He had said it so consistently, so naturally, that Margot had started thinking of it that way too, long before she understood what it meant. 6,000 going once, the auctioneer said. Margot unclenched her jaw. She thought about the drainage culvert outside Portage-la-Prairie. She thought about what the officer who had come to their door had told them. Quietly, carefully, the way they trained people to say things they would rather not say. That when the backup unit arrived, they had found Denis Théberge down and Ridgeline standing over him. That the dog had not allowed anyone near the body. That they had needed to call a handler from the Winnipeg unit to bring Ridgeline in. That she had been assessed as acutely traumatized. That they had found scratches in the earth around her father's position, where Ridgeline had paced. 6,000 going twice. Margot stepped forward. She did not plan it. There was no strategy in it. She simply stepped away from the wall and walked through the standing spectators toward the auction floor, toward the velvet barrier rope, and the security attendant who had been watching the room looked at her and started to move. She did not stop. She went under the rope, not over it. She heard the attendant say something sharp behind her, heard someone in the crowd say something she didn't catch, heard the closer of the two handlers bark a warning that she was inside the safety perimeter. She ignored all of it, because the part of her brain that processed social consequence had apparently gone somewhere else, somewhere quiet, and what was left was just forward motion. Ridgeline heard her coming. The dog's head came up. Her ears, which had been pressed back and down since she entered the room, rose and rotated forward. Her nostrils opened. The low, continuous tension that had held her body rigid since she came through the staging door shifted, not into calm, but into something else, something alert and searching. Margot stopped 4 feet from the dog. The handler closest to her was white-knuckled on his control pole. "Miss," he said, his voice very level and very serious, "this animal is classified as a bite risk. You need to step back right now." Margot did not look at him. She looked at Ridgeline. She did not try to imitate her father's voice. She could not have, even if she'd wanted to. Denis Théberge had been a large man with a deep, deliberate way of speaking, and Margot was not that. She was her own voice, which was quieter and lower than most people expected from someone her size, and which shook slightly now despite the fact that she was trying to keep it still. She said the command her father had used every morning when he arrived at the kennel. She had heard it 100 times over the years, on the voicemails her father sent when he was at work, in the background of phone calls, through the door of the training building when she had visited the detachment in Ottawa once, at 19, and stood in the hallway listening. She said, "Ridgeline, pied gauche, left heel," in French because her father had been from Saint-Agathe-des-Monts and had trained Ridgeline from the beginning in French commands, a small private habit that was not in any file the auction catalogue had consulted. The room went still, not gradually, not with the slow dying of noise the way a room quiets when it becomes aware something is happening. It went still the way a room goes still when something occurs that nobody has a category for. Ridgeline stopped moving, her body, which had been in constant micro-motion since she entered the room, weight shifting, muscles flickering under her coat, the endless mechanical stress of a dog in sustained distress, simply stopped. Her head was raised and her ears were forward, and she was looking at Margot with an expression that any person who had ever known a dog well, would recognize immediately and be unable to explain adequately. She made a sound. It was not a bark. It was not a whine. It was something low and broken that came from the back of her throat, the kind of sound a dog makes when a door opens that it had given up believing would ever open again. The handler on the right had gone white. He was staring at Ridgeline with the expression of a man watching something he had been told was impossible. Then Margot heard something else. From the rows of holding kennels along the back wall of the building, where 14 other dogs had been vocal and restless since the auction began. A German shepherd working the latch on its kennel door, a Dutch shepherd pacing and vocalizing, a Belgian pair that had been trading tension back and forth for 2 hours. One by one, the sounds stopped. It took about 8 seconds. The auctioneer had not called the lot. He was standing at his podium with his gavel halfway up, looking at the auction floor with an expression he had clearly not been required to have before. In the third row, a man in a dark canvas field coat stood up. His name was Phil Okafor, the same Phil Okafor who had retired after 22 years in the RCMP's police dog services, who had worked alongside Denis Théberge during a joint operation on the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border 11 years ago, who had made 4 phone calls to help Margot get into this room. He was a compact, quiet man with close-cropped grey hair and a way of occupying space that suggested he was always aware of every exit. He stood up without particular drama, the way people stand up when they've decided something. He did not speak to the crowd. He spoke to the auctioneer. "I'm Phil Okafor, 22 years PDS, retired 2019. That dog," he said, his voice carrying without effort across the silent room, made a call that saved the life of a constable in Thompson in 2022. The handler she bonded with died in the line 14 months ago. That young woman is his daughter. He looked at Margot, not unkindly. She didn't come here because she has money. She came here because that animal has been in a concrete run for 14 months, and someone should have done something about that before it came to this. He let that sit in the room for a moment. Then he looked at Darren Bryce. Bryce had his arms crossed. He had the expression of a man who believed in process and found this departure from it objectionable. Phil said, "How many of the dogs your company runs are still on their feet at age 10? Bryce said nothing. Phil looked at the auctioneer. He opened his jacket and removed a folded check. He said, $12,000. Put it on the lot." Margot turned to look at him. She was breathing very carefully, the way you breathe when you are trying to hold everything in one place and not drop any of it. Phil was already looking at her. He said, quietly, the way her father used to say things that were not up for discussion. "Your dad and I worked a 3-week operation out of Dauphin in 2013. It was cold enough the diesel gelled in the tanks. He kept me from making a bad decision that would have ended my career, and he never mentioned it again." He shook his head slightly. "I've owed him for a long time." He handed the check to the auction clerk standing at the table. "You can put the rest toward the transfer costs." Darren Bryce looked at the check. He looked at the room. He made the calculation that everyone in that room could see him making, and then he set his bidding card on his chair and picked up his jacket. The auctioneer brought the gavel down. Lot 19, sold. Margot stood on the auction floor for a moment without moving. Then she walked toward Ridgeline, slowly, the way you approach an animal that has been through something you can't fully know. She crouched down about 2 feet away and held out her hand palm up, the way her father had shown her years ago, not reaching, just offering. Ridgeline stretched her neck forward. She pressed her nose into Margot's palm. She held it there. She inhaled, slow and steady, working through the scent with the focused attention of an animal, consulting a language more complete than anything spoken in that room. She found what she was looking for, the residue of someone known, carried in the bones and blood of someone new. It was not Denis Théberge, but it was something that had come from him, something that carried the specific frequency of a person she had trusted more than she had trusted anything, and it had come back to her in the only form still available. Ridgeline pressed her forehead against Margot's chest. Margot put her arms around the dog's neck and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would have been adequate, and she was a person who had been raised to understand the difference between words that served a situation and words that interrupted one. The handler to her left was still holding the control pole, though his knuckles had eased. He said, professionally, that they would need to secure the animal for transport in a reinforced crate, that the muzzle should remain on until the animal had been evaluated in her new environment by a qualified behaviorist, that there were forms to complete at the table. Margot looked up at him. She said, "Release the pole," he said. "I can't recommend." Phil Okafor said, from where he was standing, "Release the pole." The handler looked between them. Then he unclipped the control cable. His colleague did the same on the other side. The poles came free and clattered against the concrete, and 40-odd people in that room held whatever they were holding. Margot reached behind Ridgeline's head. She found the buckle of the nylon muzzle, stiff with use, the clasp slightly bent, and worked it loose with both hands. She pulled it free and set it on the floor. Ridgeline did not bite. She did not bolt. She dragged her tongue once across Margot's jaw, a gesture so specific and deliberate it seemed less like an animal reflex and more like a signature. Margot stood up. She unclipped the short lead from her jacket pocket. She had bought it at a farm supply store in Moose Jaw the day before, a plain red nylon lead, nothing tactical about it, and clipped it to Ridgeline's collar. "Heel," she said in French. "Pied gauche." Ridgeline's shoulder came in against her left leg. The dog's gait, which had been rigid and grinding since she entered the building, settled. Her head came up. Her ears went forward. She moved in the clean, precise way she had been trained to move by a man who had spent 3 years doing it right, carrying the muscle memory of someone she had loved in every line of her body. They walked down the center of the aisle toward the exit. The men on either side stood back, not because anyone told them to, not out of any formal gesture, but because a room sometimes understands what it is watching, even when nobody names it. Some of them looked away. One man near the back, with a Winnipeg Rifles pin on his collar, took off his hat. Phil Okafor stood by the door. He held it open without ceremony, the way he'd held doors through 30 years of work that nobody would ever write a memoir about. Margot walked Ridgeline out into the cold prairie air and stood in the empty parking lot for a moment, feeling the wind that came off the flatlands to the west, steady and indifferent as it always was. Ridgeline pressed against her leg. Margot looked out at the October sky over the Rockies, pale and enormous, and thought about her father. Not the hard parts, not the phone call, not the form letter from the commissioner's office. Just his voice calm and specific, saying what needed to be said and nothing extra. She scratched Ridgeline behind the ear that had not been damaged, the right one, which still came to a clean point. "It's okay," she said. "It's okay. We're going home." 7 months later, in the spring, a small bungalow on the east side of Moose Jaw had a new arrangement. In the backyard, the grass was coming in along the fence line, and a Belgian Malinois lay stretched in the first good sun of April, her legs twitching in some private dream. Her coat was brushed and even, and the scar on her left shoulder, shrapnel from the drainage culvert, a detail that had appeared in a single line in the incident report and nowhere else, had faded to a flat silver thread. She did not pace the perimeter. She did not rise at sounds the way she had during the first months, when Margot had slept on the couch to be near her, had learned to set her hand on the dog's ribcage when the nightmares came and hold steady until the trembling passed. She did not do those things anymore, not often. What she did, most mornings, was meet Margot at the back door when Margot came out with her coffee. She would stand and look at her for a moment, the same searching look she had given her on the auction floor, assessing and confirming, and then press her head against Margot's hip with the full and deliberate weight of an animal that has decided something permanent. Ridgeline's war was over. She was where she was supposed to be, in a yard with grass coming in along the fence, guarded by nothing more than the memory of a man who had understood what partnership meant, and the daughter who had driven 9 hours to bring her home.